Hello, I am Xarkun and this is World of Warships Legends. What you see on the screen here is me adjusting my commander build for Kurita before I take him out into battle. Note that I have the Evil Sparks skill selected in his legendary row of skills, and that is what we'll be testing out today over the course of 2 games, one with the Evil Sparks skill active and one without. And we are of course playing the only destroyer on which I think the Evil Sparks skill makes any kind of sense, and that is the Tier 7 Japanese gunboat destroyer, Akizuki. Now, this game on the Atlantic features Evil Sparks, and the second game will not feature Evil Sparks, but it will feature the same Kurita build, just with a different legendary skill selected. Before we get into discussing what I think of the Evil Sparks, let's get some background on that particular skill. I don't think it was originally amongst Kurita's skills when he debuted in this game. Instead, I think it was added to him around the same time that Equilibrium of Power was added to other cruiser commanders in this game. And the Evil Sparks skill is essentially the destroyer version of the Equilibrium of Power skill. It increases the destroyer's main gun's high explosive shell penetration, but it comes at the cost of a drastically reduced high explosive alpha strike, whereas the Equilibrium of Power skill increases the cruiser's high explosive shell penetration, but comes with the downside of a decreased fire chance. You don't get a decreased fire chance on Evil Sparks, you get a drastically reduced alpha strike instead. But, of course, the benefit is that with that decreased alpha strike, you get massively increased penetration. In fact, the Evil Sparks increases penetration on Destroyer High Explosive more than Equilibrium of Power increases penetration on Cruiser High Explosive. Now, the penetration of HE shells, something I've talked about before, very easy to figure out how much armor your HE shells can penetrate. All you do is take the shell caliber in millimeters and divide by 6, generally. That gives you the value of armor that those guns can penetrate with high explosive. Now, the Akizuki and some other ships in the game follow a different high explosive penetration rule. Instead of dividing by 6, you divide by 5. And this is because the Akizuki has exceptionally small guns, only 100 millimeters in size. And if they followed the 1/6 penetration rule, then they would only be able to penetrate 16 millimeters of armor, which would make them pretty useless at everything except starting fires. For example, most destroyers that you'll come across at Tier 7, I think, have something like 17 to 19 millimeters of armor plating everywhere, including their superstructure. So if you can only pen 16 millimeters, then obviously you're not going to be doing any damage to those. But with the 1/5 penetration that the Akizuki's 100 millimeter guns enjoy, you can pen 20 millimeters of armor at base, which means you're perfectly capable of dealing damage to any Tier 7 destroyer with your high explosive shells. But when you add Evil Sparks, you increase the penetration by 50% and drastically reduce the alpha strike. So you can see I've actually immediately switched to AP against this ZF6 after seeing that the Evil Sparks skill is really making my shells do a lot less damage than the AP. You can see with one shell hit with the high explosive there, I got something like 250 damage, and then with the armor piercing penetrations, I got 500 something damage. So this is a drastic decrease in the alpha strike. I believe without Evil Sparks, the Akizuki's high explosive alpha strike is something like 1200, and with it active, it goes down to something like 700, which is the lowest alpha strike for any destroyer in the game, and frankly, I don't think it's a good trade-off. But what are you getting in return? Well, 50% increased penetration, which means your little 100mm guns go from penetrating 20mm with their high explosive shells to penning 30mm with their high explosive shells. And that does give you some benefits, I suppose. It means that your shells are going to penetrate more places on more enemy battleships, and it also means they're going to penetrate more places on enemy cruisers. Take the Edinburgh, for example, the Tier 7 British light cruiser, which is coated in 30mm armor plating. Now, if the Akizuki was shooting at the armor plating of the Edinburgh without evil sparks, all it would get is shatters. But with the evil sparks shooting at the Edinburgh, you would get pretty much all penetrations, although they wouldn't do a whole lot of damage. So that is essentially why you would want to run the evil sparks, is if you want to increase the penetration of the high explosive shells and get more guaranteed high explosive penetration damage instead of relying more on, say, damage that you inflict by lighting fires. The problem is, I don't think the consistent damage that you get with high explosive penetration under the Evil Sparks skill is worth the trade-off. I don't think this skill is in a very good place. Now, they did buff it from what it was during this September 2021 update. The Alpha Strike was even lower before this update took effect, but even after the update, I think it's still far, far too low. It reduces the Alpha Strike by, I think, 50% for a 50% increase in penetration. And while that sounds, I suppose, fair and balanced on paper, 50% increase at the cost of a 50% decrease, frankly, the Akizuki's guns are already so low in their high explosive Alpha Strike that I don't see really the reason that you would need to do that. Now, granted, you can see the shots that we're taking against this Conqueror here, who has a rather light armor scheme. But notice that the 30mm of penetration, it's really not the threshold you want for fighting higher tier ships like this, because they're all coated in 32mm of armor. And we were getting pretty much just as many penetrations on that Conqueror as we were shatters, and that is because we could really only penetrate his superstructure. And frankly, without Evil Sparks, we would have really only been able to penetrate his superstructure anyway, but we would have been getting more damage with our high explosive. So you can see why I don't really think the trade-off is worth it. If against enemy battleships, as just a specific example, if you can penetrate the same places on them with Evil Sparks as without Evil Sparks, but the difference is you get less damage with Evil Sparks, then why would you want to take it? And that's not the only reason you wouldn't want to take Evil Sparks either. There is also the concern of, what would you even call it, the placement of the Evil Sparks skill on Kurita's tree of skills. You saw it in effect earlier in this game. I didn't point it out at the time, but the Evil Sparks skill is in the legendary row of skills, and there is something that, in my opinion, is far, far, far more valuable for destroyers in the legendary row of, I think, every destroyer commander's skills, and that is the Unstoppable skill. Now, if there is any kind of mandatory commander skill in this game for any particular class of ship, it has to be the Unstoppable skill, the legendary skill on most destroyer commanders. Why? Because the Unstoppable skill allows you to continue moving with a damaged engine module. And earlier, my engine module was damaged. Now, I was unspotted at the time, but because it was damaged, I was only able to move at a top speed of 7.5 knots, and that penalty would have lasted until my engines repaired themselves, which is a time of 30 seconds. In other words, an eternity for destroyers. So, if you find yourself in a situation in the Akizuki or any other destroyer where you don't have Unstoppable activated, and you get hit with high explosive and that takes out your engine, your only solution is to use your damage control. But if you can't get away from the threat, you get hit again and your engine gets taken out, suddenly you're dead in the water, you can't move faster than like 7 knots, and you have to deal with that for 30 seconds. So you can't disengage, and oftentimes you're going to die. This is why you want to take the Unstoppable skill on pretty much every destroyer across every build. Not doing so is super, super high risk, particularly for gunboats like the Akizuki, which are going to be spotted a lot of the time. And if you're spotted, you're probably going to be shot at. You're shot at, well, modules like your engine are going to break, and you really need Unstoppable to help you out in those situations. So those are, I suppose, the two essential reasons that I would not take Evil Sparks. But, to be fair, you still can win gun battles with Evil Sparks against destroyers that aren't as great of gunboats as you are in the Akizuki, like the Shimakaze. You can see that so long as we get the majority of our 8 shells to hit this guy, well, we do decent enough damage to take him out. And, of course, this isn't really a fair fight. We do have assistance from a friendly battleship there. And, in fact, I think the friendly battleship did the lion's share of damage in that exchange. But even without him there, I think we would have probably been trading fairly well for the Shimakaze, partly because his aim wasn't quite as on point as mine. Nevertheless, we finished the battle with a pretty good result, and we're going to jump into the next one now. Domination mode battle on the Northern Waters map. In this battle, we're not running the Evil Sparks skill. We're running the same Kurita commander build that you saw in the beginning of this video, except we're using Unstoppable in the row of legendary skills instead of Evil Sparks. And if you're going to use Kurita on your Akizuki, this is how I recommend you set him up. Don't bother with the Evil Sparks unless they change it to reduce the penalty to the Alpha Strike. In fact, I think that penalty should be gone entirely. You shouldn't have a penalty to the Alpha Strike with Evil Sparks. Instead, you should get a penalty to the fire chance, and the penetration you get with Evil Sparks should be increased from 30 millimeters to 32 millimeters. In other words, it should do the same thing as the Equilibrium of Power skill does to light cruisers. 32 millimeters is a much more important armor threshold than 30 millimeters because, like I said, every battleship at Tier 7 has 32 millimeter plating pretty much everywhere except for the more heavily armored parts of their ships. And if you want to do consistent high explosive penetration damage instead of relying on your fire chance, well, then that's what the Evil Sparks skill should do, in my opinion. As some of you may know, I have been dabbling in World of Warships on PC, and I do have the Akizuki in that game. I was able to use the free XP I acquired through some free super containers that I managed to snag my hands on to boost all the way up the gunboat Japanese destroyer line on PC to get to the Akizuki. And on my commander build on PC, I run the IFHE skill, which allows me, I think, to penetrate 32 millimeters of armor. and that is much more effective. The downside with the IFHE skill on PC is only that my fire chance is decreased, but that can be mitigated slightly by using the signal flags on the PC, which increase the fire chance, and also there's a skill on the destroyer commanders called Demolition Expert, which increases the fire chance as well. So that can be mitigated, and if Evil Sparks increased the penetration to 32 millimeters on Legends at the cost of fire chance, I believe there might also be some ways to mitigate that as well. Even so, I think that would be a better trade. As it stands, just remember, without Evil Sparks, you can pretty much only penetrate the superstructures of battleships, so you need to aim at that, and then any fires you get, well, those are icing on the cake. Now, of course, either way, whether you're going to run the Akizuki with or without Evil Sparks, if you get broadsides from battleships or cruisers or destroyers, you should switch to the armor piercing. You'll find that it's a lot more effective. Now, this Iowa, by the way, I don't know what these battleships think, because this is not the only Iowa in this game, or not the only battleship, rather, that's going to do what this Iowa is doing, and that is pushing into my smoke screen. Now, granted, this is probably a bit of a mistake on my part. I probably should have left the smoke screen before the Iowa got this close to it, because you can see I'm spotted here for a very, very long time, and there are a number of ships out there that can shoot at me. They just happen to really not be capitalizing on that. And the Iowa, I don't know what he expected, but what he got was death for rushing my smoke screen. Scharnhorst out there, we're gonna start opening more fire up on him. And at these kind of ranges, sometimes it can be difficult for enemy battleships to return fire to the Akizuki, although it is nowhere near as effective and as an open water gunboat as something like the Khabarovsk or the Tashkent. It's just far too slow for any of that kind of stuff. You really aren't going to be dodging too many shells, and it's a huge, massive target. So you do want to limit your open water gunboating in this particular ship. But as I said, I think it's more effective without the Evil Sparks and with this current build I'm using, and I think that's pretty much all I have to say about the Evil Sparks skill, other than I advise Wargaming to change the skill, make it so that the shells can penetrate 32 millimeters of armor, and instead of lowering the Alpha Strike, lower the fire chance. That's the solution I'd like to see implemented, and I would also like to see the Evil Sparks skill removed from the legendary row of skills, so that it's still possible to take the Unstoppable skill. And instead of being in the legendary row of skills, I think that perhaps it should be in the very last row of commander skills as a third or fourth option. And if they were to do that and make the skill the way that I suggest, then I would like to see that skill added to other destroyer commanders, perhaps the USN destroyer commanders, or the Russian ones, or maybe even the French ones. I think having extra penetration with the high explosive shells on those gunboats, but at the cost of decreased fire chance, would be an interesting choice that you might want to make on some of those gunboat destroyers, including the Akizuki. But for now, if you like the Akizuki as much as I do, just abandon the Evil Spark skill, run Kurita, or better yet, run Togo so that you can get an increased fire chance, and use the guns. You can see just how effective the armor piercing is against the broadside of the Colorado there. In fact, I think many battleships and cruisers would find it very surprising how much damage they take while giving broadside to an Akizuki. You can see that with the high explosive shells, when they don't shatter, we're probably getting around 1,000 damage per salvo with our 8 shells, but with the armor piercing against broadsides, we're getting like 2,000 damage a salvo, and that adds up very quickly considering these guns reload in less than 3 seconds. Frankly, this is just my favorite Japanese destroyer in the game. I don't really care for the torpedo boats. The gunboat destroyers are what I like, and this is a very good one indeed. Now here comes the Scharnhorst, doing the same thing that the Iowa did earlier. The Scharnhorst has torpedoes. Like I said, the Akizuki is kind of a clumsy ship, so there's a possibility that if I were a complete potato, this Scharnhorst would be able to kill me with his torpedoes. Maybe that's what he's trying to do. But actually, he is making a even worse decision than the Iowa. Although, you know, good for him, he manages to take quite a bit of hit points off of me by shooting me with the high explosive, and he's able to dodge my second set of torpedoes. But I did hit him with one. He's on such low health that we should be able to take him out here with our guns. Just a little bit too angled for our armor piercing to be super effective, though. He goes down to one of our teammates, and there are only 4 ships left alive on the enemy team. So now we can just focus on this Vanguard and this Colorado out here. I think my open water gunboating in the Akizuki is going to make one of my teammates very, very nervous. You can see the friendly Colorado pinging to support me, and I think in a second, when he realizes that I'm not going to stop shooting my guns at the Vanguard, he is going to ping me 3 times to get back or disengage, something like that. But maybe he's doing that because he's like, oh no, you know, this destroyer is spotted by these guys, he's going to be shot at by them. Well, maybe. I mean, they did shoot at me. They missed. There he is pinging me. And I am shooting armor piercing, which, you know, to the average player, probably shooting armor piercing at a battleship in a destroyer might look like a, I don't know, a foolish move, but you can see just how effective this AP is, even at ranges in excess of 9 kilometers. I mean, we're doing a number to this Vanguard. And I suppose that is one thing to be said in favor of Evil Sparks, by the way, is that even if you have that running on your high explosive shells, well, your armor piercing shells are just as effective with Evil Sparks active as they would be without Evil Sparks, since Evil Sparks does nothing to armor piercing, only to high explosive. Now it's just the Colorado, a cruiser, and an enemy destroyer left, and we are raining down a hail of armor piercing firepower into this Colorado superstructure. He is going to go down quickly, and his death is going to mean that we win the game, because we're at 963 points. So, in conclusion, Evil Sparks, post-buff in this September 2021 update, in my opinion, and you can take my opinion for what it's worth, Evil Sparks is not useful enough to use on the Akizuki or any other Japanese destroyer. I hope that Wargaming is aware of this feedback. I hope they get more of this feedback. I don't know how interested the community is in the Evil Sparks issue, but I hope Wargaming makes further adjustments. Hope you enjoyed the video. If so, give it a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.